Our text this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, beginning with verse 13. Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 13 through verse 21. Hear the reading of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. And when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. What a meal! What a miracle! With 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus fed a crowd of 5,000. And lest we assume that 5,000 was the total number of recipients, Matthew tells us that there were 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. No wonder this is the only miracle story that appears in all 4 Gospels. Now, the days leading up to this spectacular miracle were discouraging, to say the least. The last paragraph of chapter 13 tells about how the people of Nazareth, by and large, rejected Jesus as a prophet. Yes, he did have some wisdom, and there were some reports about miracle working, but these people had watched Jesus grow up among them. Why, he was the son of the carpenter. And they knew his mother and his siblings by name. How could he be some special prophet? Matthew says that he encountered such skepticism among the Nazarenes that he could only perform a few miracles. Now, ironically, at the very time that Jesus was rejected in Nazareth, Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about Jesus' fame as a miracle worker. Well, this scared old Herod. He had just beheaded the famous prophet John the Baptist. So when he hears about Jesus, he assumes that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. This would explain the numinous powers that Jesus possessed. And of course, if Herod had already beheaded John once, he would likely want to do it again. So when the disciples of John tell Jesus about their master's fate, Jesus embarks in a boat and heads for privacy. He needs time away from the crowds, time to grieve John's death, perhaps. Time to pray for strength in spite of recent setbacks and discouragements. But if Jesus wanted time for rest and for prayer, he didn't get it. The crowds heard that Jesus had left by boat, and so they walked along by the shoreline until they came to that place which had been deserted until they got there. In fact, the crowds arrived before Jesus even made it to that spot. So that when Jesus disembarks from the boat, he's faced with this massive multitude. This is not what Jesus had anticipated. And yet, when Jesus sees these people, along with the sick children and family members and friends that they had brought for healing, his heart went out to them. He felt compassion in the pit of his stomach. So, he doesn't hop back in the boat and leave. And he doesn't try to make the people go home. But rather, he heals the sick among them. Now, how long that healing went on, we don't know. What we do know is that when evening approached, his disciples urged Jesus to dismiss the crowd so that they would have enough time to go to the villages and buy some bread before it was too late. And then Jesus says what sounds like the silliest thing. "They don't need to leave," Jesus replies. "You feed them." Well, the disciples, incredulous, say, "What? We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish." Now that doesn't sound like enough to feed Jesus and the 12, much less this great crowd of thousands. The response of the disciples really should have settled the matter once and for all. I mean, there's just no way they can feed this horde of people. Case closed. But just at the point of impossible, Jesus utters the most amazing words. "Bring the bread and fish to me." I just wonder what was running through the disciples' minds as they fetched that little dab of food that they had hoped would be their supper. Now Jesus takes charge. First, he prepares the masses for the feast to come. He has them sit down on the grass in preparation of this evening picnic. And then the evangelist Matthew uses words that remind us of Jesus' actions when he would later institute the Lord's Supper. He took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. Now, how the miracle occurred, we're not told. It's kind of annoying, isn't it? We'd sort of like to know exactly how this miracle worked, but we're not told. The evangelist only tells us that the people ate until they had their fill. In fact, there was more food than that voracious crowd was able to consume. Now today, of course, we just throw away the leftovers, right? Scrape them off into the garbage can and go on. But in a world in which wheat and fish were hard to come by, people saved food. And when everyone had eaten so much that they were about to pop, there were still 12 baskets full of food that the crowd had been unable to eat. Now, what does this story say to us? Well, I think that one clear meaning of the story is staring us in the face. It's the elephant in the room. The disciples at Locust Street are just like the disciples of yore. As we drive to and from our building, we see the staggering multitude of people who need Jesus and his gospel. We see the homeless, the poor, those whose lives are being scourged by the demons of drunkenness, of meth, cocaine, and heroin. We see the poor children who've been left to raise themselves, to fend for themselves. We see the jobless who have been ravaged by the effects of the Great Recession, it's called. We see the haves who have walled themselves off from the have-nots and whose worship of the god of Mammon is yielding lives that glitter on the outside, but on the inside are as hollow as a diseased tree. And we see people from all social and economic and racial classes whose families are being torn apart by casual sex and by divorce. Shall I continue this litany of needs? And like the disciples of old, we're tempted to look at Jesus with shock and with disbelief when he says to us, you feed them. You take care of their needs. You speak the gospel in their hearing. You teach them how to be citizens of the empire of Christ. How can the few disciples at Locust Street even begin to address the vast multitude that surrounds us? We're so few in number. Just look around. We're so few in number, and we're meager in resources. Yes, that is absolutely true. We are few, and we have so little to offer the crowds around us. But that was precisely the case of Jesus' first disciples. Their food supply was a pittance. With 5 loaves of bread and 2 measly fish, they could have hardly fed themselves. But Jesus knew that. And that's the reason why he said, bring your knapsack to me. You can't even get started with your little pile of grub, but watch what I can do with it. Let me ask you some questions. Do you believe that the story of the feeding of the 5,000 really happened? Okay. Do you really believe that Jesus fed untold thousands of people with only 5 loaves and 2 fish? Do you believe that? Do you believe that the Christ who is alive and present with us today is as powerful as he was back in his earthly ministry? Yes. Be careful. You're walking right into my trap. Now, if you've answered yes to these 3 questions, then you must admit that if Jesus wants to, he can take our puny resources at Locust Street and he can multiply them for the people of Johnson City. The latter would be no greater miracle than the miracle that he performed long ago on the Galilean Sea. But there's one crucial requirement upon which everything hangs. We must bring our resources to Jesus. We must take what we have and put it in Jesus' hands. Now, what exactly do we have? Let's take inventory. First of all, we have a building. That's more than a lot of the world's churches have. And not only do we have a nice, comfortable auditorium, but we also have a library, we have various classrooms, and we have a well-equipped kitchen and dining hall. Well, I can't really say whether the kitchen is well-equipped or not, but you women could answer that question. And secondly, we have people. We don't have a lot of people, but we have some people. We have about 30 people who are really dedicated and devoted to this church. And what do we, as 30-some-odd people, have? Well, we have money. Not a whole lot, perhaps, but definitely some. We have time. Many of us have time that younger people who are busy with raising families and full-time work simply don't have. And we have age and experience. We have been around the block a few times. We didn't just fall off the turnip truck. Surely the wisdom that comes from faith plus experience has to mean something. Now these and other resources are precisely the resources that we have to put into Jesus' hands. Admittedly, we can't do much with them, but if we're really believers, then we must admit that Jesus can. Now comes the hard part. What does it mean? What does it look like for us to take our resources, our assets, and put them into the hands of Jesus? That's the $64,000 question. I know that you get this illusion. My students at the college didn't understand the $64,000 question, but I know that you do. And that's what this question is. I don't know the answer to this question. And I suspect that most, if not all of you, feel the same way. But we have to begin somewhere. And the best place to begin is always with prayer. I'm going to conclude this sermon with a prayer, but I have an assignment for you this week. And next week I may even ask you whether you did your assignment. At least one time this week, if not more often, I want you to pray. I want you to pray that God will open our eyes and help us to see how to place our resources into the hands of Jesus. How do we bring what we have to Jesus so that he can multiply those for the sake of the people of Johnson City? People for whom Christ died. Let's begin as a church, as a community, to try and to discern how we can place our meager assets into the hands of the Master who can feed the multitudes today just as easily as he fed them long ago. Let's pray. Our God, our faith is often weak, and our vision is often dim. We need your help. We need for you to open our eyes and to give us wisdom, to help us see what it means for us to take who we are and what we have and put those resources into the hands of Jesus, that he might again work his miracle. In Jesus' name we pray. In just a moment, we're going to sing a song of invitation, number 143, Jesus is Tenderly Calling.